Hello, welcome back to the 31 Days of Books. My name is Ari, and part of my goal each December is to kind of do a bookish reset. So I'm gonna clean up my shelves. We've got the TBR shelf behind me. I've got red books over there and over there. Then where I usually set and record my video, you see all the books that I've read for the year. So at some point I need to go through all of the books that I have in this room, take the books that I've collected in 2023 and put them on my TBR shelf. This is old TBR shelf and I got a new one that's underneath you, so I can't exactly show it to you. And then unhaul a ton of books that I've either already read and don't want to keep or I'm never going to read. And part of unhauling books I'm never going to read, I want to go through the books that I received in 2023 in book boxes and read the first chapter of all of those and see if they're worth keeping at all. This stack right here are the 12 books that I have received in various different book boxes or like blind dates with a book type things over the past year that I have not read. I'm sure you noticed two books at the bottom of this stack that you can't see what books they are. These books are both published by St. Martin's Press, and I'm not talking about books from St. Martin's Press, so I'm not going to be reading these in this video, and I'm not going to be talking about these at all. I'm not even going to tell you what books they are, because if St. Martin's Press wants free advertisement, even on a tiny little channel like mine, then they can hold racist employees accountable for their actions, or at least acknowledge it instead of pretending like it never happened. And that leaves me 10 books that I am going to talk about in this video. Go through, read a chapter of these, maybe the prologue, whatever, and decide if I'm going to keep them. Some of them I don't think at all that I'm going to keep, just without even reading them, but I am going to give every single one of these a shot and then see what I think. First up, we have Singing in the Shrouds by Niego Marsh? I'm not sure how to pronounce this lady's name, but yeah, this is a murder mystery written in the late 1950s. And in the prologue, we get the mystery. A young woman delivering flowers to a cruise ship is found dead in an alley on the wharf. And the first chapter, or the prologue, it's kind of both. It's literally chapter 1, prologue with a corpse, or prologue with corpse, there's no A in there. And it's from the perspective of a policeman who is patrolling those wharfs. While he's patrolling these wharfs, he's watching all these people get on this cruise ship that's about to leave at midnight, and he comes across a taxi driver who is waiting for his fare, who went onto the cruise ship like 30 minutes prior and hasn't come back yet. And the taxi driver's like really pissed off, and he's like, where the hell is this woman? She said it was going to be 5 minutes, she's still not back. So they go search for her, find her dead body in an alley. She never made it to the ship in the first place. And then I assume the rest of the book is going to figure out who the murderer is, right? So maybe partially locked room murder. I'm not going to finish this. Mostly I don't care about murder mysteries. It's just not my thing, especially like the ones written in the 1950s. And then this one in particular, the like slang of the era is just wild. I've got a couple of lines that I wanted to read to you. At one point, a seagull cries. It's actually probably the girl getting murdered, but he thinks it's a seagull. And he says, "You don't often seem to hear seagulls at night. I suppose they go to sleep like Christians." The fuck does that mean? And then the other one that made me unnecessarily uncomfortable is he's talking to the taxi driver. The cop is talking to a taxi driver. He does not know this taxi driver. This is the first time they met. And the cop says, "What was she like, Daddy?" And let me tell you, in modern times, that has a very different connotation than what it's supposed to imply this book. But the first time he says Daddy, and a couple lines later he says, "Now I think I'll just take a wee look around, Daddy." Or, "Now I think I'll just take a wee look round, Daddy." Like, what? The way this is written, the language and everything like that is just off the wall wild to me. And I'm not really interested even though it's really short. I don't really care. So, this is going away. Somebody else can enjoy it. Next up, I have Genius Squad by Katherine Jinks. This is the second book in the series, and I'm not really sure why a book box would send me a second book in a series. Maybe it can be read as a standalone. The first chapter just kind of like introduces us to the main character, whose name I literally already forgot. Cadel. His current living situation. So he's a teenage boy, well, a preteen, in a foster home. This is obviously middle grade just from reading the first chapter. We also get a very brief recap of like the events of the first book, it seems. So this is obviously middle grade. It reads very much middle grade. It kind of starts off with like setting up the conflict between our main character, translator, and his foster brother, who like pees on his bed. And then it also establishes that the adults in this universe, like many middle grades, are going to be very incompetent and distant. The foster mother is like, you shouldn't do that, and like there's no consequences. It's like bad parenting, very obviously. This is in absolutely no way of interest to me. I don't even really know what the plot is from the first chapter, but I can tell by the writing and like the setup that this is not something for me, especially because it's the second book in the series. So why would I read the second book without reading the first book? We have a guest appearance. Barely in frame guest appearance. Let There Be Light. The Houses Without Doors by Peter Straub. Weirdly enough, this is very similar to the last book. But while that was middle grade, this is obviously horror. I mean, I hope you could tell by just looking at it that it's horror. But this also follows a very young boy, a 9-year-old boy, who's a bully. And in this first chapter, he is bullying his little brother because he wants a car that his little brother got for his birthday. And so he basically tells the little brother that his teacher's gonna murder him unless our character Harry will talk to the teacher, but Harry's only gonna talk to the teacher if little brother gives him this race car that he got. The only other thing that we really establish in this first chapter, other than Harry is a 9-year-old bully and just generally a bad kid, is that their mother is also not a good person, and her entire dialogue in this first chapter is telling her sons how trash their father is and how much she hates their father, who she apparently is still married to. So again, even though this is not middle grade, I still don't like bad parenting as a plot point in a story. So I'm gonna just skip this one. I don't need to read it. The Uninvited follows a 25-year-old woman named Ivy in World War II. Ivy has a curse where basically anytime somebody is going to die that she knows, one of her dead relatives appears to her as a ghost. So it's not the person dying that appears as a ghost, it's just a random relative. In this chapter, it seems to be her uncle or her grandmother will appear to her, and then somebody she knows or cares about dies. In this first chapter, her grandmother appears to her quickly, and then her father and younger brother show up, and it turns out that they have killed a man simply because that man was German. So World War I people are very anti-German. One of her other brothers has died in the war, so her father, who is just a hateful man from all accounts, decides an eye for an eye and kills a young German boy in exchange for his son dying overseas in the war. This is the first book that I've read so far that's interesting, and I definitely want to continue on. Okay, next up I've got Too Near the Dead by Helen Grant. The first chapter in this one is a woman in a wedding dress has been buried alive. I read the first line of the next chapter. It's a dream, but yeah. that doesn't really give me much other than her like exploring the inside of this coffin. But what it does tell me is that I don't really like the writing that much. There's a lot of similes being used in this, and it's very obvious and very like academic writing. And by academic I mean like if you're given an assignment in like 6th, 7th, 8th grade to write a story, you're going to use this many similes. So not the best writing. And then I read the back of it just because I didn't get a whole lot from the first chapter, and this just doesn't sound like something that I'm interested in. Like the tagline is, sometimes it's terrifying loving somebody this much, and that just doesn't sound like something that I would even be vaguely interested in, as I'm not a fan of like codependent relationships. Okay, so The Lost Ones by Anita Frank. This, like, the first chapter wasn't the most engaging thing I've ever read, but it like didn't put me off wanting to continue reading it, if that makes sense. Like, I'm not super excited to read this where I need to read it right now, but I'm interested enough to continue on eventually. This one also takes place in World War I, but this is like the very end of World War I, and our main character Stella has lost her fiance in the war, and basically in the first chapter she's in church, she's back home, or she was a nurse, but now she's back home, so that's why I think the war's over. And she's in church, and there are a couple of mothers who are grieving for their dead sons, and then she's grieving for her fiance, and then there's like this maid that her mother hired, and while they were away while she was away at war, and it's kind of like the maid's a little bit weird, and their families have this kind of like intertwined history. So even though the maid's a little weird, her mother felt that she had to hire her because of their family history. None of that really has anything to do with what's on the back of the book, but the back of the book sounds sort of interesting, so I'm fine with continuing to read this one eventually, though again, I'm not like super excited. The House of Ashes by Stuart Neville. This was an interesting first chapter. So this old woman lives alone in this house, and it seems like the town considers her the crazy old woman. She lives in this house with a bunch of cats and some ghost children. And in the middle of the night, one night, she hears a loud crash, and it seems like somebody has thrown something through the window and set the house on fire because the house is burning down. I will tell you right away that at least one cat is killed in this fire. And it is graphic on page. And the old woman makes it out of the house, but I think she dies based on what's on the back of this book. The first chapter doesn't really say anything about the book at all, other than like set up the fact that this house has been burned down by somebody. The house has a bunch of ghost children that this old lady cares for, right? The book itself follows a woman named Sarah Keene, who moves into this house with her husband Damien. And then Mary, who is the old lady, doesn't understand why Sarah and her husband are living in her home, but Mary can also remember that the fire burnt down the house like 60 years ago, which is why I'm pretty sure she's dead. If she was already an old woman and she doesn't remember anything from the past 60 years, she's definitely dead. Right? She's a ghost. One thing about the back of this book is the very last line. It is, Sarah soon becomes obsessed with what happened in that house nearly 60 years ago, the tragic bloody night her husband never intended for her to discover, which makes it sound like Sarah's husband is the person who, Sarah's husband is assumingly the kid who threw the thing through the window, maybe? But that would make him, like, at least in his 70s, and I don't know how old Sarah is, so, not sure about that. But yeah, I'm interested enough. I'll keep on reading this one. Okay, The Hiding Place by Amanda Mason. I read the prologue and part of the first chapter because the prologue was only like 2-3 pages long. It didn't really give anything. Got into the first chapter and we meet our main characters, Nell, Maud, and Nell's husband. So Nell is stepmom, Maud is daughter or stepdaughter, and then there's the dad, but he doesn't seem to be a perspective character. So we meet them as they are arriving at this like rental cottage somewhere. Right off from the bat, like, I don't like these characters. Nell is coming across as a total Karen, super freaking entitled, kind of bitchy for no reason. She obviously doesn't like her stepdaughter. She doesn't like her husband, which, to be fair, I don't blame her for not liking her husband, because he instantly comes off as, at minimum, emotionally abusive and gaslighting. I'm sure it's going to turn into like actual physical abuse later in the book. Maud, we don't really have much from her other than Nell's snarky thoughts about how much she hates her stepdaughter. But I don't care enough about this book to read even through the first chapter. I got to like a stopping point. And I was like, yeah, no, I'm done with this. I'm good. Moving on. All right, the chapters are really long in this, so I didn't get through all of chapter 1, but I can pretty much instantly tell that I am going to want to read this book. This is a slave narrative following a young girl named Annis. She is the product of rape, and her white father raped her mother. And she's a teenager in here, and you could tell pretty early on that her father is going to try to rape her too. I don't know if he's going to succeed or not. I haven't gotten to that. So it's pretty harsh, it's pretty gruesome, but very much expected from a slave narrative. Her grandmother, her mother's mother, was a African warrior woman, and her mother kind of teaches her to fight the way that her mother taught her. So you have these like you have these two narratives competing with each other, with a powerful woman versus a slave in the Carolinas, which is awful. So I think this book is going to be very dark and depressing and just horrible. But I think but I can already tell that it's going to be really well told. I will just have to read it in a particular mindset, because it's gonna be rough, as expected, because that's what these women went through. All right, The Blade Between by Sam J. Miller. The first chapter of this really gives nothing. It's basically a really quick history of the city of Hudson, New York. So I went and read the description, and it's basically this guy left Hudson for New York City, has to come back because his father's ill, and then he gets with some of his friends from childhood to fight the gentrification happening in Hudson. And then I think it's also a horror story, so maybe ghost whales. That's all I'm getting, is maybe the ghost of the whales are not happy about the gentrification, and they want to go back to their prostitutes and meth labs. Which, prostitutes great, meth labs maybe not so great. So the description does nothing for me. It gives me absolutely no interest, and I've read Blackfish City by this same author and absolutely hated it. So between those two things, where I'm not particularly interested in the synopsis to begin with, and I already know that I disliked another book by this author, I think I'm gonna go ahead and pass on this one. So out of the 10 books that I started with, I'm getting rid of 6 of them. That's quite a few. We don't need these on our TBR. I don't need these on my TBR going into next year. I got plenty of other books to read that I'm more interested in. And I am going to keep 4. Out of these 4, this one is really the only one I'm super excited about. But happy to read all 4 of these. Let me know if you've read or heard of any of these books, and if I'm making a mistake by getting rid of them. There's still time to save them if they should be saved. But I will see you tomorrow for another video. Bye.